Okay, hi guys, welcome. This is actually the first of two 25-minute sessions. I've got the whole hour.
Oh, okay.
So what I'll be sharing with you is really about standards-based grading. Let's see. But it's particularly about preparing our engineering students. Since I work at a community college, and I primarily teach these engineering students, one of our goals is to send them to the four-year university with the skills that they need when they get there. I feel like this topic might not quite fit Semiode, honestly, because it's less about modeling and more about making sure that the students have the skills that they need when they get to the four-year university. So this presentation and the following presentation are about basically two things. One is standards-based grading, and one is backwards design. And basically, what I've done is, since I teach Calc 1, Calc 2, Calc 3, and Diffie, we have a set of program learning outcomes. Those are the goals for all of our students by the time they finish at TCC. And I have taken those and reinforced them for 4 semesters at TCC using standards-based grading. So that's the idea. Do any of you guys teach calculus primarily? I know Michael is teaching Diffie. Okay.
I teach it.
Is it Arati?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Khalid, how about you? And Olivia, you said you're an undergraduate. Are you studying math?
Actually, I'm not. So I am a medical anthropology major.
Okay. Have you taken differential equations for your major?
I actually have not taken any math in college, but I took through AP Calculus BC in high school. So I learned differential equations, but it's been a couple of years.
I gotcha. Okay. All right, great. So let me share. And then, Nathan says, I'm a high school teacher teaching calc and pre-calc. Awesome. Nathan, do you teach, is it an AP Calc class or?
Yeah, I teach Calc BC. I'm also, the reason why I'm at this conference is because I'm going to be pitching a differential equations class that focuses on, it's a modeling class. And so I'll only really talk about differential calculus and then just dive right into modeling and data collection and the cool stuff like that. That's awesome.
Awesome. Okay, well, very cool. Glad to know you guys a little bit better and to learn more about your backgrounds. So at TCC, what we're trying to do is, again, prepare our students for the four-year university. And it's actually a really simple set of program learning outcomes. And when I say program learning outcomes, I'm thinking of for the AS Math degree, or if we're not talking about AS Math degree, anybody who would go through Calc 1, Calc 2, Calc 3, and differential equations. So if they're an engineering student and they would be eligible for that AS Math degree, we still want them to have the same skills that a math major would have. And it's pretty straightforward. At the end of their time at TCC, we want them to know how to graph pre-calculus functions and solve related equations. So that's to be expected. But after talking to some of the faculty who teach the engineering analysis class at OSU Tulsa, we've seen that some of our TCC students actually struggle a little bit, even with graphing piecewise functions when they're studying the Laplace transformation and just solving some equations that they ought to know how to solve when they leave TCC. So that's why that's on there. And then, of course, we want them to know how to compute or estimate limits geometrically, algebraically, and numerically. And of course, the two big things for calculus, we want them to know how to take a derivative and we want them to know what it means. We want them to know how to take an antiderivative or evaluate a definite integral, and we want them to know what it means. So we want them to be able to differentiate pre-calculus functions, all of your basic functions, including exponential and logarithmic functions, using your basic differentiation rules up to and including the chain rule. Of course, we're going to teach them all of the content that is typically taught in Calculus 1, but logarithmic differentiation really isn't touched on a lot later. What we really want them to master are those basic rules and the chain rule. We're hoping when they leave TCC, they still remember that 4 semesters later. then we also want them to be able to interpret all of those derivatives geometrically and in applications as an instantaneous rate of change. And as I said, we want them to be able to anti-differentiate and integrate functions using U-sub, integration by parts and partial fractions, and of course your basic rules. And then interpret antiderivatives and also integrals geometrically in applications. Primarily in applications, I'm thinking in terms of a net change function, but of course, there are other applications as well as we cover in Calculus 2. And then as far as differential equations are concerned, we want them to be able to classify and solve certain linear differential equations using an appropriate method and to apply the Laplace transformation method to solve initial value problems. So this is a long list, but I mean, it's just basically what any calculus teacher would want. We want them to understand the basics of algebra. We want them to know how to compute a limit and understand what it means. We want them to know how to compute a derivative and understand what it means, and to compute an antiderivative or an integral and understand what it means. And of course, we're going to apply all of that knowledge that we hope that they would have gained in Calc 1, 2, and 3 in differential equations when we're solving differential equations. And then we've got a list of learning outcomes for Calculus 1, but I think I'm going to skip this. Given my understanding of my audience now, I'm going to skip this. Okay. Okay, so regarding standards-based grading, question is like, how do you do that? I don't know about your institutions, but I think pretty much every institution has course learning outcomes associated with every course, program learning outcomes associated with every program. And sometimes that can feel like checking a box if you're a faculty member. Like you have to for the administration, and so we're finding some way to collect data and show that our students have these skills. But if you've taught Calculus 2, you know a lot of your Calculus 2 students don't necessarily remember U substitution, and they might struggle with the chain rule. Or if you're teaching differential equations and you ask them to solve a problem using the method of undetermined coefficients, if they can't do the chain rule or they can't do the product rule, they can't efficiently solve any of the problems that you're asking them to solve in differential equations. So with all of those learning outcomes in mind, the key is like, how do we actually get them to retain this? How can we ensure that the students who took Calculus 1 with us will be successful in Calculus 2 because they have maybe not mastered all 5 chapters that we covered in Calculus 1, but have mastered the core material that's necessary for success in the next class in the sequence and throughout the sequence. And I think standards-based grading really does that. So this is the outline for the standards-based grading part. We're going to talk about what standards-based grading is, what a C in pre-calculus means, what makes a grade or making grades meaningful using standards-based grading, and how we pitch this to our students, because if they don't understand it, it's not successful. The benefits of using standards-based grading in our courses, and some logistics and other challenges. And then this will probably take a whole hour, and then we'll wrap back around to those program learning outcomes and sort of tie it all together. But Arati, will you tell me when it's the 20-minute mark so that I can take questions, and then we'll take a break and then come back?
Okay, okay.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so standards-based grading. It's also known as mastery grading. In standards-based grading, grades are determined by how well the student displays a mastery of certain course standards. And there are about 30 standards per course. So I'm teaching the same content in Calc 1, 2, 3, and differential equations, the same core content that every other faculty member at my institution is teaching. Just rather than dividing the material up into 4 exams, I divide the material up into 7 to 10 quizzes, and each of those quizzes includes a number of standards, somewhere between 2 and 5 standards per quiz. And rather than giving grades on each quiz, I give them grades on individual standards for those 30 standards per course. Now, each standard is graded on a 4.0 scale. 4 is an A, 3 is a B, 2 is a C, 1 is a D, 0 is an F. If the students understand a GPA scale, they're okay. Sometimes the students struggle a little bit. If they get a 3 out of 4, sometimes they'll think they got a 75%, and you have to remind them 3 is a B in this class. But every standard is graded on that 4.0 scale. It can be interpreted as a GPA is interpreted. And again, those standards are covered in 8 to 10 quizzes and a comprehensive final. And a key component of standards-based grading or mastery grading is that students can improve their grades through a process called reassessment. So basically, if they get a grade that they don't want on a standard, like let's say that they don't learn very well how to solve a first order linear differential equation, maybe they struggle with that integrating factor method, then they can retake a standard quiz during office hours and they have the opportunity to improve their score. Basically, the old scores are thrown out and the new score replaces the old score. 70 to 80% of the final grade in the course comes from standards quizzes, and the rest comes from homework and the final exam. That percentage changes based on the course and then based on my experience with the previous semester. And the same is true for that. Now, all of these are clearly articulated in the standards document. So the standards document might look like this. This is for Calc 2. This is the beginning of the standards document. For every course, there are prerequisite standards. G1 and G2 are the prerequisite for Calculus 2. They include algebra, trig, and arithmetic for G1, and then Calculus 1 prerequisites. So every time a student uses a Calculus 1 technique and a Calculus 2 problem, I give them a grade on Calculus 1 prerequisites. Now, I'm constantly rewriting over that grade. Every time they use Calc 1, I give them a new grade for that. So that grade changes and it adds a little bit of noise to their grade as the semester progresses, but it does allow them to have some feedback if the students are struggling in Calculus 2 with an improper integral. And the problem with their improper integral is that they don't remember how to evaluate limits of single variable functions from Calculus 1. I would give them an appropriate grade on Calc 1 and I'd say, hey, go back and look at limits at infinity or look at these types of limits, review L'Hopital's rule, and I'd give them a grade there. And then there are grades for all of the individual course standards as well. And to make all of this feasible, we do have to provide some limitations, on reassessment opportunities. I can't just let any student take any quiz anytime they want. Just because of logistics, it would be too difficult to let students retake everything as many times as they want to. So I will limit either the number of reassessments per standard. I used to say you can reassess on every standard once, or you can reassess on every standard once, and you can reassess on 5 additional ones twice if you need to. Or I'll limit the number of reassessments per week. That's what I'm currently doing. I let my students do 1 reassessment per week. Some semesters in the past, I've used time-limited reassessments. So if they take a quiz, they have 2 to 3 weeks after the original quiz to reassess over the material on that quiz. Now, why do we do this? Again, it's because of that backwards design. We want them to learn what they're supposed to learn. And I think that standards-based grading allows us to do that a lot better than a traditional grading scale would. And so I call this slide, what does a C in pre-calculus mean anyway? And standards-based grading will tie grades to evidence of learning. Because your students are very concerned about their grades, and with good reason. They're concerned about their GPAs, especially our engineering students are concerned about their math GPA and getting into the engineering program. They have to apply for that at OSU Tulsa, which is where most of our students go. And this is going to allow us to take that numerical grade that they had in an exam before and then split it into pieces. And each of those pieces is a much more meaningful piece. Before I show you that, I want to actually, no, I don't think I can do that. Never mind. I was going to show you more of the standards document, but I can show you that later. So here's a comparison. This is for a pre-calc class. Let's say student number 1 and student number 2 come out of your pre-calc class, and they're both C students. At the University of Tulsa, where I did a lot of my graduate work, we would have 3 exams in our pre-calc class and a homework score. And student number 1 and student number 2 might have grades like this, but they both end up with a C in the class. What differences do you notice between those 2 students?
Obviously, one has mastered a great deal more of the material than the other. Number two.
Okay, so student number two, and how do you know?
Because he performed to a high degree of excellence on the first couple of exams. And perhaps, I mean, obviously grades don't necessarily infer motivation or anything like that. So you don't really know what happened with the third exam, but something happened and it wasn't good.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Is that what you guys are seeing as well? Everyone else? Yeah.
I guess I'd say that if the grades reflect what they learned, I mean, that's just taking that as an assumption, then the first student did a fairly consistent job of not really mastering anything. And the second student mastered 2 out of the 2/3 of the course, and really, well, as I've forgotten who said that, but anyway, said that either they had a bad day, they were sick, or some other sort of thing interrupted, or they just didn't study the last month of the course. I don't know.
That's exactly. That's what I see too. Student number one didn't really master much, but they got enough points to get a senior class. And they might be in your Calc 1 class next semester. And student number two at TU, that exam 3 would be trigonometry. Exams 1 and 2 would be various topics from algebra. So that student doesn't really know much trig. And that student would be starting your Calculus 1 class without any trig background or without much of a trig background. But still, we don't really know what this student learned and didn't learn from trig. And we don't really know anything about what the student number one learned. We just know that they have enough points to go on to the next class. And I don't know about you, but have you guys ever had a C student in one class who became a D student in the next class just because they didn't have the skills they needed to be there? Is that a common experience for you, or is it just me? And I'm talking about, okay, just making sure. I mean, it's possible. I'm like, maybe it's just TCC. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, my experience has been that, you know, sometimes you have a student in Calc 1 who's just barely scraping by in Calc 1, and then they get into Calc 2, and they're going to have a really hard time in Calc 2. Or a student who just barely scraped by in the calculus sequence, and now they're in your Diff-E class, and they can't evaluate any integrals, they can't evaluate any derivatives, they can't rearrange an equation. And they'll tell you, I know how to solve the Diff-E part, but I can't do any of the other part. Is that enough to pass this class? I said, I need you to be able to solve a differential equation. I'm sorry. So that can happen. But I think part of the problem is that these grades aren't necessarily meaningful. I mean, particularly like as a measure of what they were supposed to learn. Like maybe it's a good measure, maybe it's not a good measure. But certainly having the content grouped into 3 exams wouldn't be as helpful as breaking it up into more pieces. So let me show you what standards-based grading does for us.
Sasha, this is your 20 minutes mark.
Okay, thank you. Do you guys have any questions yet? Okay, I think I will take the next 5 minutes because I don't think anyone has questions yet. Let me tell you about standards-based grading a bit. After I used standards-based grading, we had these types of, or these are before I used standards-based grading, we'd have these types of conversations. I was gone yesterday, did I miss anything important? These problems are hard, I'm just gonna skip that one on the exam. I only need 3 points to get a B. Is there anything I can do to get those points? And then after, the students are like, why did I get a 2 on the mean value theorem? Like, why is that a C and not a B? And so we'll have these discussions about what the difference between a C and a B is with regard to the mean value theorem. And I'm struggling with graphs of transformations. I have got a specific grade for graphs of transformations. Can you tell me what I'm doing wrong? They got a 1.5 on that. Or how do you know when to use U substitution versus integration by parts? I'm not doing very well my integration by parts standard because I'm getting them mixed up. Or, you know, in a Diff-E, I got a 1 on eigenvalue methods. What am I doing wrong? The good thing about SBG is they are giving grades for all of these individual topics. And when they're giving grades for these topics, then they start asking about the topics themselves, as opposed to saying, how many points do I need to get a grade in the class? Now, sometimes they still will say, I really want a C, or I have a C, but I want a B. What can I do to get a B in the class? But when they say that, when they ask that, you can shift the conversation to talk about what they need to know. And this will be the last thing I talk about before our break. So these are real grades from a pre-calc student at the University of Tulsa. This is from the grade book, and these are the individual standards in that class. Can you guys see any patterns here? What does the student need to work on?
Exponential functions.
Exponents and logarithmic functions. Oh, and here's some summary stats. They have a 4.0 homework average. Their standards average is a 2.67. They need a 2.75 to get a B in the class. And they say, I want a B. How can I get my grade up to a B? Well, you look at your grade book and you say, well, you really don't know much about exponents or logs. You're struggling with all of these 4 standards. Now in a diffie class, it's going to look different. You're probably going to have separable equations, first order equations, applications of first order equations, modeling problems as individual standards. But you can look at the grade book and you can see what the student needs to work on. So when the student says to you, I have this grade in the class, I want this grade, you can look at the grade book and say, this is what you need to study. This is what you need to work on. Let's work on that. Let's focus on the parts of exponential and logarithmic functions that are most important for the next course in sequence for you. And then they have an opportunity to reassess and improve those scores. And is it time? Is that 25?
2 more minutes.
Okay. Yes, exponents and logs, exactly. The students struggling with these topics, and you can direct them to study for those topics and improve their grade. And we can re-average this. If she earns 3s on 2 of these, then her new average will be a 2.8. She'll get a B in the class, and she'll also actually know some things about logs and exponents when she moves on. So that would be a very good thing. And actually that student did do that very thing. And she brought up a couple of these grades and turned her C into a B. Now this is what the grade book typically looks like, at least on Blackboard for me. I've got my columns on Blackboard with the individual standards and then the students over here. The rows tell you how a particular student is doing, but the columns can tell you how you're doing. She was not the only one who struggled with exponents and logs that semester. Maybe I need to work on my lecture or I need to do something differently. But by looking at these columns, I can see that many of my students have a 1 on graphing exponential functions, and many of my students earned 1s on graphing logarithmic functions. And so I know by looking at my columns where my class is struggling, and I can put that course standard on another quiz if I want to bring it back so that they have another opportunity to do it in class. I can revise my lecture, but the grade book itself gives me a good sense of what the students know and what they don't know.
This is 25 minutes mark.
Okay. So now is it time for a 5-minute break?
I think we can continue, and so you can finish because it's a continuation. So.
Okay. Does anybody need a break? How are you guys doing?
So I have a question here.
Sure.
This is the ethical question.
Yes.
So let's say I have 50 students, and let's say 40 students, they are doing well. Or let's say 1 or 2 students, they are not doing well. So do you think that giving them and regrading them, and because those who have done, they have learned for the first time and got the score, the good grades. Now I'm just pushing them to pass. Is it the ethical thing that I can improve, and then let them pass? This is just the ethical question.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. If I mean, just think about just in your own life. Hopefully, we have the opportunity to make a mistake and be wrong sometimes. And in math, you're solving a math problem. You maybe a beginning student would be evaluating an integral. You try a method and it doesn't work. You try another method and it doesn't work. And you want the students to be willing to try and to be willing to take risks. So I think I think it's ethical to allow everyone that opportunity. And I will say that this is not just for the students that are at the bottom, because the B students and the C students often want to improve those grades as well. And I've even had students that are A students, they don't even like the 3.5, and that's risky because taking it over again could lower your score. And but they'll say, oh, I got a 3.5, I really want a 4 on that one. And letting them retake it just gives everybody the opportunity who wants to and has the time to invest the time to study more and watch their grade go up as a result.
So it means that in this process, everybody can get an A. And also, is it fair to the people who are writing for the first time the test and those who are repeating for the 10th time? Because I'm allowing them to do it as many times until they get the A grade.
Well, I think you have to think about this, the instructor and the workload as well. I wouldn't do this to a TA. Like, I mean, since I'm the one who's grading it, that's okay. But if I had a TA and I was at a 4-year university and I was making my TA grade all of this, I don't think that would be ethical. I think then you have to think about, you know, the TA's time. But if you make those reasonable restrictions, you say you can only reassess on 1 standard per week and you only have 16 weeks and we have 30 standards in the course. You know, what do you want to work on? What's most important to you to learn? Then as long as you make it reasonable for the grader, and it's easy to make it reasonable for the grader when you're the grader because you're thinking about your own workload, yeah, I would say if you have a TA helping you, just treat them the way you would want to be treated as far as that workload is concerned, and then it's okay. Yes, Nathan?
Yeah, I just want to interject also. I think part of the dissonance here that Arati is experiencing and voicing comes down to what are your purposes behind the teaching of the course, and what are you going for? So when we assign grades to students, right, there are 2 general reasons why we assign grades. 1 is to measure the learning, and 2 is to rank. And as a high school teacher, I mean, I run up against this all the time because, you know, my students are super high powered. They want to go off to top universities all over the world.
Yeah.
And they're in the grading for the ranking. And so when you talk about in terms of like ranking students, is it fair for everybody to get a you know, a 4.0 or whatever in your course? That's really saying, okay, how do we want to rank students? But if you're really looking for outcomes, because like say, for example, you've got a feeder program into a college, and all you want them to be able to do is get into their courses and be successful and then go on to be you know, successful engineers, then you're not really doing it for the ranking anymore. You're doing it to make sure that they've gained the necessary knowledge, right? And so this is the tension, right? Because I think, Sasha, what you're talking about really boils down to, we want to assign grades that allow us to measure what they've learned so that we can determine whether they're appropriate to push forward in the feeder program, versus what Arati is talking to is like, we need to maintain kind of an equitability in terms of, if this person is number 1, it's number 1 because they're the best, not because they just kept doing it until they succeeded. Then we can't measure the difference between those 2 cases because we don't know how many times it took.
Sure.
So here I can ask that before taking the test, are we doing enough to prepare for them to take the test? Is it are they ready? So am I checking that what they are doing their homework or not? So are we doing the best thing for them to write the test, or after they write the test, they know that they failed, and then I will try to improve them?
Well, I think I hear where you're coming from. It's important that we get some feedback from the students, some kind of assessment of their knowledge before they take their first exam or before they take their first quiz.
Like
and so using homework.
Yeah, homework. Am I doing enough to prepare them to learn what they need to learn to take the test? So then if I'm after them, okay, why don't you do this homework? Homework, you have many questions. They have many different choices. So if they are prepared well, I hope that they will be doing, because questions are similar kind. It's not that we are getting from.
Yes. Yes. And those students who did very well in the homework that take the quiz, they'll take the quiz and they'll get the 3s and the 4s the first time, and they won't have to take it again. And that is a huge benefit to them, like not having to take it again. Like the students all would like to get 3s and 4s the first time and to not have to worry about that. So I think you are going to have some students who are in that camp. But I think with the others, it's not necessarily that we haven't done our job doing everything that we can to prepare them. But I don't know about you, many times, even giving a lecture on the chain rule, or I have a colleague who actually spends 2 days on U substitution in Calculus 1. I don't think watching him work more problems helps them get better at U substitution. Even if they do all the homework, if they're doing all of the homework with resources, they're using online help and online equation solvers and things like that to help them with the homework. They're thinking through all of the material, and that's good. They're still not in that testing situation where they're presented with a problem and they have to solve the problem completely correctly from beginning to end with their own brain, and that's it, and no other resource. And so there are those students that are maybe in the C category or even in the D category who don't get it the first time, and watching us do more examples isn't enough, and even doing the homework with all the resources isn't enough. That's it's for them. It does help them.
So in this situation, what is the goal? Let's say if a D student who is really not able to do something, so how long we can prepare them so they will get an A?
Well,
So
it's not.
so if you want to make them C just to pass the course, so what is your motivation here?
Sure. It's, of course, we want them to get an A if they can get an A, but we want that A to actually measure what it intends to measure. So it's not really, for me, it's less about the A, although the A is associated with the grades. It's about that particular set of skills that were that they gain from taking your class and then going on to the next class. So if the student doesn't have the skill yet, I want to give that student the opportunity to gain that skill. And I will let them reassess, but again, there are limitations. Only 1 per week. There are only 16 weeks in a semester. You can't reassess on everything. You have to pick and choose. And we want to pick and choose based on what's important for Calc 2 or Calc 3 and so on.
So why cannot we do it with homework? Let them be master of this thing.
I think we can do that with homework. And
this is the same thing, doing homework and then take the test.
Sure.
Instead of taking the test and reevaluating them again.
I think with homework though, even with WebAssign, we use online classes. If I allow my students like lots of opportunities to get the question right, it's still not a good, it's not the same as solving the same problems in an environment where you have no other resource but your own brain and a piece of paper. And I think the students.
So I believe homework should be like until, let's say somebody is not doing, they are taking the resources. After some time they should stop and use their own brains so that if they really want to learn.
Right. So this is giving them incentive to learn, because there are the very best students that genuinely want to learn that material, who will do the homework over and over again for their own learning's sake. And there are some students who are really more concerned about the grades. And this is providing an incentive to those students who would typically be more grade oriented to be more learning oriented. Because what they often find out is that as they study and they learn the material, they get higher grades and they're surprised. They're like, all I had to do was study? They say, yes, all you had to do was study. And now you know how to do something. And because you know how to do something, your grade went up. And so they'll study again and their grade will go up, and they'll study again and their grade will go up week after week. And it becomes reinforcing that good study habit. So I think it's a good thing, giving them that incentive structure. Not everybody takes advantage of it. You're still going to have some students that don't, but when they learn that studying pays off, then they'll study more.
Well,
can I make one more point? I would like to actually see the rest of this presentation as well, but your point about incentive structuring is really good. As I said, I teach some pretty high-powered students, and they're highly, highly responsive to incentives because they want those grades.
Yes.
And when I first came to my institution, we allowed reassessments, but it was really, really poorly designed. So one of the things that you have to be super careful about is how you go about the reassessment process, because we would allow students to reassess up to 100% on a test, and regularly, and this wasn't my policy, I thought it was the worst thing in the world, and it played out exactly like you'd expect. The students would come into my first versions of my tests or whatever, would take it, but they're just saying, oh yeah, this is just a practice test, I don't really need to do anything. And they go in, they look at the test, get a sense of the questions, leave, go have someone tell them how to answer the questions, then come back and do the reassessment and get 100%. So you have to be really careful about what you're incentivizing by allowing reassessments, because if you set it up badly, you get exactly the opposite effect than what you're talking about right now.
Yes, I agree. If I did that with whole exams, and I've done that in a pre-calculus class before, that's exactly what would happen when the student can retake the entire exam, then they're just seeing an alternate form of the same thing. Then they use that as a preview of the second version of the exam. And they are doing the same thing, something similar, but this time when they're getting their quiz back with all that feedback on it, they're like, why did I get this grade on this standard? Like, why did I get a 1.5 on this topic? And I'm like, because it was an applications of differential equations problem and you couldn't set up the differential equation. Like the whole thing is read the problem statement and set up the IVP and solve it. You couldn't set it up. And so we would have a conversation about what they actually need to work on, and then they would work on it. So they're still seeing that preview, but now when they're seeing a preview, of something very specific, and they're getting feedback on what they did wrong on that very specific topic. And then they're going home studying that very specific topic and then reassessing, and then their grade goes up because now they know how to set up an IVP in your Diffie class. And you're like, okay, now I'm happy to give you a 4 because you learned it. Like everybody's happy whenever those grades improve because they're actually learning what you wanted them to learn. But yeah, if you do it for a whole exam, I've had the same experience that you're talking about, Nathan. It's not providing the incentive that we want.
So we were also very happy that they are doing well and good.
Yes,
So,
yeah. Very good.
Yeah, but the problem is that you have to grade every exam twice, and the first version is trash. That's miserable.
Yes. Well, I tell my students, it's okay if you're not ready for this quiz, go ahead and take the quiz. Please let me give you some feedback. And if you leave everything blank, it's very easy to give a 0. It does not take me any time to assign that 0. And they hate the 0. They look at the grade book and they're like, oh, I have a 0. I'm like, do you know how easy it would be to bring that up to a C? I'm like, you would like, here's the minimum amount of knowledge that you would need to know to be successful in calculus 2. Like, let's at least get you to that point. And that 2 points, it's like replacing an F on your transcript with a C on your transcript. It improves your GPA in the class a lot. But yeah, I go on and on about this. I love this little system.
so let's go for the second part.
Okay. So let me see if I can change this little piece here. Go like that. So this is more about benefits. With this at TCC, I feel like I'm able to keep my standards in the course very high, and not referring to course standards, but very high academic standards. Before, I would feel bad because the distribution of students was such a wide range of skill sets walking in. And I think that happens because at TCC, we've got 22 full-time math faculty. I don't know how many adjunct faculty we have, but we've got 4 campuses, and some faculty have very high expectations, some faculty have less high expectations. And so you've got students in your class, your Calc 2 class, that don't know how to take the antiderivative of a polynomial without a formula sheet. Like, I had one problem, it was like the antiderivative of 5 on the first quiz. Like, I thought everybody would get the antiderivative of 5, and 20% of my class could not tell me that the antiderivative of 5 was 5x plus c. And I was like, how did 20% of our students get all the way to calculus 2 and not knowing the antiderivative of 5? But with this, I can give them a 0 and give them a 1 and say, you know what, you're not where you need to be yet. And this is not a permanent label. This does not mean you're a D student or an F student. This means you don't have this skill yet. You are not where you need to be on this skill. Let's go home and work on that skill. And then you can try again next week. But again, you can't try it for all of them. We have to pick and choose. So you really are going to have to study. So I can set those high standards. Expectations are very clear with the course standards document. I'd like to show you that if possible. Let me, hold on a second. Let me share something else with you. Here we go. I have a math resource website. It's myname.com. And if you go to teaching, you can see all the course materials for the classes I teach. On each of these classes, Calc 1 through differential equations, there's a standards document, and I've already brought those up. So here's the Calc 1 standards. Like they've got limits graphically, limits numerically, limits algebraically, and it's very clear. Like with limits algebraically, there are a lot of things they need to know how to do. They need to eliminate a 0 over 0 indeterminate form in these 3 ways. They need to know continuous functions. They need to know exponential and logarithmic functions and their limits. And they have to know how to recognize and evaluate an infinite limit algebraically. And it's all outlined right there on the document. You guys are a Diffie crowd. So here's the Diffie one. They've got 3 prereq standards going through Calc 3. And then we've got a lot of methods with differential equations. First order differential equations, we just start with some definitions and terminology. And I tell them if it's on this list, it could be on the quiz. If you can do everything on this list, you'll be prepared for the quiz. And then the application problems is really more of the modeling. And then I always have a standard that's choose the appropriate method for each of them. But this document tells them what's expected of them. Like if you can do everything in this little paragraph, then you'll probably do well on this preliminary theory for higher order differential equations, for example. So it makes all of the expectations very clear. Oops, where were we? Here we go. And we've talked about a lot of this already. They can improve their grades. The students hold themselves accountable. Because they see that 0, they don't like it. They see a 1, they want to improve that grade. And I tell them, if you work hard, you can get that A that you want. But sometimes they realize pretty quickly that it's hard to get that A. 4 is perfect, like 3 is good. You know, it's like, that's very good work, but we have some room for improvement there. It stresses mastery and it makes the grades themselves meaningful as a measure of all of those things on our standards document. And we encourage them to learn from mistakes and feedback. It helps them develop a growth mindset and become sort of gritty and to persist. And then this is sort of my talking points for how I convince my students to do this. I actually have a version of this coffee cup from Game of Thrones. I've never actually seen Game of Thrones, which is kind of funny, but I just love the quote, I drink and I know things. So the students, like I have my coffee cup that says I drink and I know things. I drink my coffee and I know things. And I tell them, you know, they want to be people that know things. They want to be people that know things too. So I'm talking to my engineering students and I say, you know, you want to be an engineering analysis and when your professor is doing a derivation on the board and they're using a triple integral and they're evaluating all of these things, you want to be able to follow along. You don't want to be lost in class. You don't want to remember that you've forgotten that, because that's what so many of them do. They're like, I remember something about Taylor series and that was hard and that's all they remember, but they don't really remember things about Taylor series. They just remember that it was hard. We want them to actually know the material well enough to follow along in their 3000 and 4000 level classes. And so I will tell them these things. You know, it's okay to make a mistake, but you do need to know the material by the end of the semester, sooner the better, because it's going to build on itself. And I always joke and I say, everyone's going to want to study with you because you're going to know so many things. It's just, it'll be so popular because because you're going to know so many things. And this is a pitch that works for my students. They learn what to study and how to study. They learn that they can learn challenging material. When those grades go up, they feel good about it. They also learn that they have to actually understand what they're doing to get an A. You can't just collect points. Like to get an A, to get a 4 or a 3.5, like you really need to know the concepts, be able to articulate the concepts, and then solve the corresponding problems. And then they can get the grade they want as long as they learn. Now, this can be tough logistically if the students don't understand what they're doing. Like Nathan was saying, they could just end up retaking and retaking things, but that's just like redoing homework problems over and over again without ever looking at your mistakes and learning from them. Like that's not going to help you. You actually have to reflect on what you did before and try to improve. So if you don't pitch it the right way, the students can be confused and they feel like, oh, doing things over and over will help me. And like, no, only if you reflect on what you've done and will it help you. And your colleagues, they also may wonder like, why are you doing this? It's a lot. It's very different from what everybody else is doing. So you kind of have to explain what the point of all of this is. I have a sign-in process or a sign-up process for reassessments. Or I don't use that right now, but I used to use a Google document where the students would tell me what they want to reassess on the week before, and I'd write the quizzes. And you've got to write all those quizzes. And you have to grade them, so you can't have to put a cap on it sometime. And one thing that I do is I post quiz keys from last semester and quiz keys from this semester for the students so that they can have a preview of the types of problems that they'll see, so they can be prepared for that first quiz. But problems are always different. I mean, I think with trigonometric integrals, for example, you got all the powers of sine and cosine, powers of secant and tangent, and product to sum formulas. They're going to be different, combinations of those every semester. So the quiz keys from the previous semester just provide a sample of the format and what an A looks like. And if you do this, you'll get an A. And then as far as academic integrity and cheating is concerned, like with Dropbox and all of the scanner printers on all of our campuses, you have to assume that your students are scanning and sharing all of these quizzes that you make. So every year or so, every year or two, like you have to retire some of the quizzes and recycle them out. I've been doing this since 2016. And I probably create about 30 new quizzes every semester, 30 new reassessment quizzes per class. And then I get rid of old forms. But now, so you have to assume that. But now, since I've done this so many times, let's say with that trigonometric integrals standard, I think I have forms A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and K for trigonometric integrals. So if the students are looking at old quizzes to study and they've got forms A through K, I'm like, basically they just studied all of the problems from the book. They studied all the possible homework problems that they could possibly study. If they have seen the quiz before and they got lucky, then that's okay with me. If they studied 12 forms of the quiz and happen to have a preview, but you do have to be careful. If you're only using like one reassessment quiz, everyone's going to have it. If you don't sort of change it up a bit. And it supports a learning culture. I think we've talked about that plenty. And there's this great book. Have you guys read this book? Yes, Nathan.
I was just going to say, I've seen some other models for doing the reassessment stuff as well. You don't necessarily have to do like reassessment quizzes like what you just described. I've also seen it done like what you'll have is tests over the year, multiple tests over the year, where you've got old standards repeated on the new test. So the student will have 3 opportunities throughout the year to demonstrate mastery of this standard without having to go through the process of scheduling or rearranging things, and without you having to write something really unique. And if somebody else passed the standard, got demonstrated excellence on that standard, or they don't care to demonstrate any better excellence on that standard. They just skip the question on the newer version of the test. And that seems like a pretty reasonable way of going about it to me too.
Yes, I tried that the first semester with Calculus 1 though, and it was
Really?
tough. Like every time the students did a product rule, I would give them a new grade for a product rule. And it was just like, there were way too many product rule grades that I had to assign. I was like, I'm just going to give them one product rule quiz. They want to reassess on product rule, they can. But yes, that is a good way to do it if you can work out the logistics and make it feasible for yourself. I didn't find a way to do that. If it was simpler for me to do it this other way. But I know a lot of high school teachers and people who have done this in other courses do that.
Sasha,
Yes.
so let's say you have taught pre-calculus and you made them learn those things, and then now they are coming to calculus 1, calculus 2, and differential equation.
Yes.
So what improvement do you see in that particular student when he's coming from pre-calculus, where you work so hard for that student? So what you see in differential equation, does he learn everything or
Oh
not?
my gosh, it's wonderful. When I have students for 4 semesters in a row, 4 or 5 semesters in a row like that, they know, like they are ready to learn differential equations because you don't have to teach them an antiderivative. You don't have to teach them a derivative. They know all of that. So they can focus on the high level objectives of differential equations, and they are not getting bogged down in the details the way that the students without those prerequisite skills are. So it's really wonderful. It's when let me bring up that list of program learning outcomes again for you guys.
Then for the differential equation, everybody should be A. They know everything by the time they go for their engineering thing. So
Yeah,
that's
well,
good.
yes. I mean, if they don't necessarily have an A in the class, or they're not necessarily guaranteed to get an A in the class, but they're not held back by Calc 1 or Calc 2 or algebra anymore. The only part that they have to focus on is, how to use the method of undetermined coefficients, how to use variation of parameters, how to set up that application problem. And if they don't have to worry about 3 semesters of calculus that they may have forgotten before, it makes learning differential equations much easier.
Yeah, I believe that if you keep a record, the person who was getting 1 in logarithmic exponential thing, and now that this same person is coming and solving any differential equation,
yes,
with integration by parts or anything, then that's a great success.
it is. It's very exciting. I had one student in calculus 2 who really struggled with antiderivatives. And in addition to all of this, I do an antiderivative quiz, a 10-question mastery quiz. They have to get a 9 out of 10 to pass by the end of the semester. They have 50 times they could try it if they want to. Just a ridiculous number of tries. I only have 10 versions. If you take it 11 times, you'll see it one again. But this student was struggling a lot with that, and he cried in class, and he was so frustrated. And we had a big talk, and there were tissues, and everybody was crying. But then I asked him to try to stay positive and try to change his attitude toward it, and try to learn, just to focus on growth instead of focusing on how this grade was making him perceive himself at that moment. And by the time he got to differential equations, as I'm working problems on the board, and I'm like, okay, so how do we evaluate this? And he's like, integration by parts. Oh, that's U substitution. Oh, you do a little bit of algebra and then you do this. And like, he knew all of the answers because, 2 semesters ago, he felt like he couldn't do it. In a traditionally graded class, he would have just done poorly on that exam and then maybe tried to study a little bit for the final and then never seen that material again. But with this class, he did it over and over and over until he got it. And then when he got to Diffie, he had this skill, and there was a confidence that came from having the skills that was really exciting.
Yeah, this is like doing homework repeatedly, and then you master this thing.
Yes, it's like that. And it's also, they establish a relationship with you as the professor as well. Like they come and they ask for help and they say, what am I doing wrong? And you're constantly talking about math and how to improve and how to get better. They don't miss the DXs anymore. They don't miss the plus Cs. They don't, they don't have inappropriate notation, because every single time they do it, I correct them and they won't get a 4. You know, they keep getting the points docked if they don't have it quite mastered yet. But once they learn that all they have to do is like learn from the feedback, like their work just becomes much, much better work. So these are our TCC's program learning outcomes. If we do this for 4 semesters with them, they can do all of these things. And they, you know, they don't necessarily master every piece of content that we teach in 4 semesters of classes, but they know how to take a derivative. They know what it means. They know how to take an antiderivative. They know what it means. They can solve differential equations, and they can rearrange an equation to solve for y. Yes, Michael.
So sorry to interrupt, since we're running short on time. I had just some logistical questions, like how many students and how is scheduling the office hours? Is that, I mean, I've done this in part, but not 70 to 80% of the course grade being.
I gotcha. I have 24 students per course, usually 5 classes a semester, and usually 3 or 4 of those classes will have standards-based grading. So I'm talking about 100 students per semester that are doing this. And at the beginning of the semester, I don't have very many students reassessing at first. The last 2 weeks of class, everyone is coming to office hours to reassess. And my students take over almost the entire math lab. The tutoring center is where I do this. But I print the quizzes in the back, and then I'm everyone's proctor, and I just sort of stand around and walk around and make sure everyone's looking at their own paper. But if a student walks in and they need a quiz, I just print them a quiz and get everybody started, and I proctor the whole time. But this is during my office hours. My office hours are 10 hours a week.
Sasha,
Yes.
we have only 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else?
Can I have a number of questions that I wanted to discuss, and I think, I don't know, is it possible for us to just continue talking? Because there's some free time on the schedule for Simeon after this.
So I think you can join the rooms and talk personally.
Yeah, we can make that happen, Nathan.
Yeah.
What I can, sorry to interrupt, what I can do for you guys is, Sasha, I can make you the host, and I'll end the recording so you and Nathan can just continue to talk on this call, if that would be the easiest thing to do.
That'd be
super
great.
nice.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect.
That is good. That is good.
Any other questions?
So is it the end of the talk, or it will continue?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you, Sasha, for very interesting and actually encouraging students to learn this subject, especially the difficult things in math. And thank you very much for giving us some tips. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure.